Hello, welcome to February's RunJumpDev monthly meeting. My name is Tim. Uh, Today we're happy to have Paul Tozour with us to talk about the Game Outcomes project. It's a really interesting analysis of things like crunch time and the way games get made. Pretty excited about it. Before we get started, I do want to talk a little bit about a few events we've got coming up. On short order here, we've got this weekend over in Louisville. Our sister organization, the venerable Game Dev Lou, will be having the grand opening for their Warp Zone co-working space. We're really excited about that. They'll have a bunch of local Louisville and Southern Indiana games on show. If you can make it over there, that starts at 6 p.m. and goes till late. And we'll be organizing some carpooling on our mailing list if you're coming out of Lexington. We've also got, coming up just after that, we've got the our indie game of the month, which is Kentucky Route Zero Act 1 this month. That is on Wednesday, right? That's next Wednesday. We'll be over at the Southland Perk Coffee House starting at 6 p.m. We chat about the design and about how that game works. And then that will lead right into the weekend, March 4th and 5th, which is the Louisville Arcade Expo. We've got partnered with Game Dev Lou and some Southern Indiana people to have the Indie Alley over there, which is going to be a bunch of locally produced games on show. And it's outside of the main event area, so you don't strictly need a ticket to get to us. We'll be there all weekend. All right. Well, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. So, I'm Paul Tozour. I've been in the game industry since 1994, so 22 years at this point, more or less, with a couple little breaks. Sort of been all over the place, and it's an honor to be able to talk to you guys today. I've got a talk coming up at the Game Developers Conference in the middle of March on the Game Outcomes project, which I'll be telling you all about in a moment. And I figured what I would do here is use this opportunity as sort of a little dry run of the talk that I'm going to give in March. It's going to be abbreviated. I'm not planning to take a full hour to do this. It should be maybe 30 to 40 minutes at most, and then I'll just open it up to any questions you may have at all, even if they're not related to the Game Outcomes project. If you just want to pick my brain or something, or talk about, indie dev projects or whatever you like. So essentially what I've got here is an abridged version of the GDC slides, and I've rearranged some stuff, so if I skip around a little bit, I apologize in advance. All right, with that having been said, let me go ahead and share the PowerPoint. All right. Okay, can you all see that okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So, again, I'm Paul Tozour. Mothership Entertainment is my tiny little indie studio in Austin, Texas. It's me and two artists and an engineer. I do a lot of programming and game design, and I'm also the producer and general manager of Mothership Entertainment. We've got a little real-time, well, it's not exactly a real-time strategy game. It's a strategy game that's coming out sometime later this year. And that's about all I can say about that. I also have an MSc in Technology Management from University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School of Business, and that's really only relevant just because the Game Outcomes project was partly inspired by some of the things I learned at my classes at the Wharton School. Hold on a sec. Okay, so the Game Outcomes project was an independent industry academic partnership. I've got all the people who participated in the Game Outcomes project study at the top of the screen.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
I think the screen share may have frozen up a little bit. You might need to reshare. It's still showing us the first slide.
Oh, okay. All right, let me stop sharing and then go back.
Maybe the whole screen instead of just the.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let me try and do that, and let me know if the problem happens again.
Okay.
All right. You guys see that okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so we're an independent industry academic partnership, and we were really driven just entirely by intellectual curiosity. It was essentially me getting together with all of these people and saying, hey, let's do a little study and see what we can learn about the game industry. The two in the upper left are from academia, Dr. Karen Bureau and Juliana Pillemer, and all the others are actual game developers. So a couple disclaimers about the study. It's not a peer-reviewed study. It's an ex post facto analysis based on a survey. So we were essentially analyzing survey results. A lot of the questions were subjective, and so there's a lot of room for biases to creep in. And of course, correlation does not equal causation. And I'll talk about the relationship between correlation and causation and how that affected our study in a few minutes. So yeah. So just to jump back to the second point again real quick, and it's an ex post facto analysis based on a survey. I mean, in an ideal world, you would have the ability to rewind to a certain point in time and say, okay, we've got some game development team and they're making a certain decision, right? And let's try doing a certain thing and trying a certain intervention. Maybe we change from Agile to Scrum or vice versa, or maybe we decide to impose Crunch. In an ideal world, you know, we could have a little time machine where we could rewind and see how the alternative would have worked out and say, okay, let's not Crunch, or let's use Waterfall instead of Scrum or Agile, and then you could see the actual differences. The reality is, there's really no way to do that. Obviously, we don't have time machines. You know, every game development team is different. They're working on different games, and so those sorts of things, of course, influence the results a great deal. So our goal was to see how various game development factors influence a game's actual outcome. Right? The hypothesis is that a game studio's culture has a significant impact on how well that project actually turns out. And so what we did was we designed a survey, you know, asked a bunch of questions about developers' most recent game projects. The survey included around 116 questions about culture, and then we'd follow that up with 4 questions about the project's outcome. And so we figured, okay, there have to be at least some cultural questions on here that we can correlate with a project's success or failure. You know, we've got all these different factors. And so we figured in the aggregate, there's going to have to be some interesting correlations we can find. So we got 273 completed responses from projects that were not canceled nor abandoned. That's out of, I don't know, 800 total responses that we got, a lot of which they never finished the survey or they related to canceled projects, which, you know, we couldn't really get useful results from any of those. And that resulted in a total of 5 articles on Gamasutra, which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't seen them already. We did have an optional question at the end, which was, what actual project did you work on? We wanted to make sure people felt confident that they could preserve their anonymity, and so we left it as an optional question. Maybe 10% of the respondents filled out that answer, but based on that 10%, you know, we know that at least these game teams were represented in our survey. We had a couple assumptions going into our survey. Chance always plays a role, right? You look at something like Flappy Bird. Flappy Bird was made by, you know, I believe a student developer in Vietnam. It really didn't do very well in, you know, its first couple months on the App Store. Nobody knew about it. Suddenly, some web streamers found out about it, started playing Flappy Bird. Next thing you know, Flappy Bird is one of the top-selling, you know, games in the App Store. I mean, there's no way of necessarily predicting with any real certainty how well a game is going to do, and luck is always going to be involved, and the market is fickle, right? We're assuming also that different teams have different cultures, and I can vouch for that. I've been on, you know, 7 or 8 different game teams throughout my career. We're testing the hypothesis that these differences influence their odds of achieving a better outcome. And we wanted to know what factors most strongly influence the odds of success. And we got some very interesting results. Couple notes, quick notes about the survey design. We randomized the order of the cultural questions to try and reduce bias. We just had SurveyMonkey totally randomize those. We had a lot of cases where we had redundant questions with opposing tones. So we would ask, did the team do such and such? And then we would also ask another question, did the team avoid doing such and such? And we just wanted to see how those different tones of voice affected the results and whether that would change respondents' perception. And it turned out we got basically a perfect inverse correlation between those two, so doing that was entirely unnecessary, and we could have cut down some of our questions by skipping that. But it was nice reinforcement that people were not just randomly filling them out and that they were answering the questions honestly and accurately. And then we had our 4 outcome questions at the very end in order to avoid bias. 2 major conclusions from this study. There are actually several, but these are the 2 ones that I can tell you about in advance without spoiling it. One is that there are enormous cultural differences between teams in the game industry, right? And these differences really cut across all different types of studios, from tiny 2 or 3 person indie development studios to 100-person teams, all across different game genres, target platforms. The differences are massive. And most of these cultural differences are actually strongly correlated with positive or negative project outcomes. So let's talk about what we mean by outcomes, right? The criterion for what makes a good outcome really differs from one team to another, right? If you're working on, a Medal of Honor game or a Call of Duty, at a publisher like EA or Activision, probably the most important thing is to make money. You want a good return on investment. At the same time, you might be a small indie development team. Maybe it's your very first time making a game, and you're just trying to kick something out the door to pull your team together and figure out what it takes to make a game on iOS, and that's fine. And maybe what you care about in that case is just the critical acclaim or the internal satisfaction of having reached your goals. And project delays, of course, are important as well. Extended project delays can seriously affect your return on investment, can affect team morale, and so on. So those are essentially what we felt were the various factors that you could, developers generally use to consider a game a success or not a success. So in order to establish, how any given game ranked in terms of these outcome factors, we had a bunch of 7-point scales. Return on investment, we asked, to the best of your knowledge, what was the financial return on investment? In other words, what kind of profit or loss did the company developing the game make as a result of publication? So anyway, I'm not going to read them all out loud, but you can see all the different things we asked about. Was your project delayed? What level of critical acclaim did it achieve? And finally, did the game meet its internal goals? Was the team happy with the game they created, and was it at least as good as the game you were trying to make? So, quick note on correlations. I would assume most of you are familiar with the concept of a correlation. But just a quick refresher, the correlation between 2 variables is the degree to which those 2 variables show a tendency to vary together. For example, we have 2 variables, x and y. In the upper right corner, we have a random cluster of dots. There's no correlation between them whatsoever. In the upper left, y goes up as x goes down. That's what we call an inverse correlation. In the lower right, x and y go up together, and that's a perfect positive correlation. So in the social sciences, a pretty low correlation is actually quite good. So something like a 0.3 correlation is a surprisingly strong correlation in the social sciences. And we used what are called Spearman correlations instead of Pearson correlations for most of the study. I won't go into all the nitty-gritty details of the differences between Pearson and Spearman. I recommend you Google that if you're super curious. But in brief, we used Spearman correlations just because a lot of the questions in our study were a Likert scale. In other words, we asked questions on a sliding 7-point scale of totally disagree to neutral to totally agree. And we felt Spearman was a better fit for that. It didn't really make much difference in the end because I ended up analyzing all the data using both types of correlations, and you essentially get almost identical results. So when we analyze the outcomes in terms of their correlations with each other, we actually got surprisingly strong correlations, and so it was very clear that these outcomes themselves were really strongly correlated. So here you can see in the lower left, you've got score for delays, score for ROI, and score for critical success along the bottom, and then along the vertical axis, you've got score for internal goals, score for critical success, and the score for ROI. And the black line through each one shows the correlation. A steeper line is a stronger correlation, and these are statistically significant results. And so anyway, that just sort of shows that in general, you know, a game with a higher Metacritic ranking is more likely to be shipped on time, it's more likely to be a critical success, and so on. So all these factors are pretty strongly related to each other. So we talked a lot about how do we combine all these different outcome scores, right? How do we basically take these four questions that we asked and figure out, you know, how do we rank that in terms of success or failure? We tried a whole bunch of different ways of combining these scores, different weighted sums and things like that. Ultimately, what we ended up with was just an aggregate outcome score, which is essentially a score that's based on, by the way, is the vacuum cleaner in the background bothering you guys? It's kind of loud here.
No, it's
okay. Okay, great. Okay. Sorry about that. The cleaning people are here. So what we ended up doing was just adding those four factors together into an aggregate outcome score. That's the sum of each of the four factors put together. And that ended up correlating more strongly than any of the various ways we tried to build an outcome score. And we couldn't really justify doing anything more complicated. So we've got a whole bunch of cultural factors as represented by over 100 survey questions. And we can correlate any individual culture question or group of questions with any one of these outcomes or with the aggregate outcome score for that survey respondent. But what does that correlation really mean? If we find that teams that used more outsourced labor, for example, instead of internal labor influences the aggregate outcome in some way, say there's a positive or negative correlation, what can we read into that? And so the outcomes are on the right, and the cultural factors are on the left. And because the outcomes happened after the game shipped, there's really no way the outcomes could have caused the cultural factors, right? So that direction of causation is impossible. If there's any causal relationship at all, it has to be the cultural factors causing the outcomes. And sure enough, you know, of course, it's a survey. It's possible that somebody's memory of the team culture while taking the survey was influenced by the outcome. You know, maybe I'm really bitter about how poorly the project turned out, and maybe I'm going to give all the cultural questions lower rankings than I would have done otherwise. So that's a possibility. But we know that either there is no causal relationship, or it's the cultural factors causing the outcomes. So let's assume we have some cultural factor, like teams that drink a cup of coffee in the morning. And I've got that along the horizontal axis at the bottom. Teams on the right drink tons of coffee all day long. Teams along the left, you know, that are right at x equals 0 don't drink coffee at all. Obviously, I didn't have coffee drinking in the survey. I'm just using this as an example to explain how we approached this. And let's say we find that, you know, the answers to that question on our survey correlate with higher values on the outcome scale for project delays. The graph might look something like this. The gray dots form a rising diagonal line, and there's a strong mathematical correlation, statistical correlation, I should say, between coffee drinking and teams that shipped their game on time. So you ask, what claims can we make about that? If we find that kind of a really strong correlation, can we say that drinking more coffee influences your odds of shipping a game on time? There's really three possibilities. Either there's no causal relationship, and this is all just a coincidence, and we can pretty much rule that out if depending on the statistical p-value of the correlation. And I'll talk about that a little later, but the p-values on everything I'm going to show you were very statistically significant, very close to 0. Unfortunately, I don't really have time to go into what a statistical p-value is, but if you're curious, I strongly recommend you Google it. A lot of websites can explain it far better than I can. Second possibility is maybe A does actually cause B. You know, maybe drinking coffee does actually make you ship your game on time. The third possibility is that maybe there's some other factor C that causes both A and B. For example, maybe it's the people you hire. Maybe studios that hire more hardworking people ship their games on time, and those hardworking people are more likely to drink coffee. So that's a possibility as well. But it does show clearly that not A almost certainly doesn't cause B. In other words, it pretty much debunks the notion that drinking more coffee makes it less likely that you'll ship your game on time. So you can say, okay, for any correlations where the statistical p-values are low enough to pretty much rule out coincidence, we can say there could have been some other input C which accounts for the results, some hidden causal factor. But we asked over 100 questions over a very broad range of cultural factors, and it's very hard to imagine that there really is much we left out of it. So we can't 100% rule out the idea that maybe more successful teams just hire better people, or maybe there's some other factor that influences these results. And there's something, maybe that better, teams are doing that isn't accounted for in our survey questions. And we can't rule that out entirely. And you're welcome to believe that there are other factors involved. But I would say this, if you have a leadership position on a game development team, and if you find there are things that other teams are doing that are strongly correlated with success or failure, it might not hurt to learn about them and see how that applies to your own teams. Maybe there's some other factor involved, and maybe not, but if there are simple things to do that could potentially raise your odds of success, they're worth taking a really close look at. So I'm going to talk about part one, non-cultural factors, things like team size, project duration, financial incentives, and so on. Okay, team size. This was really interesting. Along the horizontal axis at the bottom, we have the average team size. This is using a logarithmic scale. And along the vertical axis, we have aggregate outcome score. And there's really no statistically significant correlation with average or final team size. It tends to lean upwards towards the right side just because very large teams seem to have a slight edge, but it's not really statistically significant in terms of absolute team size. So when you see a chart like this, the green dots represent teams that are more successful in terms of their aggregate outcome scores. They're more likely to, their combination of having shipped on time, having gotten a better ROI, better Metacritic score, and so on, better internal satisfaction with having reached their project goals is higher than the red dots. So they're, shaded in green, and they're higher along the vertical axis. Project duration had a correlation of minus 0.229, so there was definitely a statistically significant negative correlation here. And that makes sense, but at the same time, it's fairly obvious. It's not necessarily an interesting result. Teams that, obviously if a team is doing really poorly, it's likely to slip its schedule to try and make it up. And so also delays tend to hurt your ROI because now you've got a larger burn rate and so on. So financial incentives. We asked a bunch of questions in terms of, did your development team offer financial incentives, and if so, what form did those financial incentives take? Was it based on team-based incentives or royalties for the game itself? Was it incentives based on Metacritic scores? I know Electronic Arts is a fan of doing it this way. Or was it based on other stuff? We also had a fifth one, which I'll show you on the next page, which was individually tailored financial incentives. In all of these cases, there were really no statistically significant correlations. This is a box and whisker plot, by the way. The gray bars show you the median 50% of the data in each category. So you see at the lower left, for example, we've got team incentives. On the left side of that little box are teams that offered no team-based incentives. On the right side of that box are teams that were offered team-based incentives. The gray box, the two shades of gray represent, two of the four quadrants of the, the median 50% of the data. So, the dark gray box is the second quartile, and then the light gray box is the third quartile. So you can see team-based incentives seem to be very slightly higher, but it's not statistically significant. Same with all the others. The one that was really interesting was that individually tailored financial incentives did actually have a statistically significant correlation with outcomes. Here you can see the mean outcome for teams that did offer individually tailored incentives was 63.2, using our arbitrary scale from 0 to 100 of game outcomes. For the ones that didn't, it was 56.5 at a very low p-value. And the effect of this, by the way, does seem to fade out for large teams, that have a final team size of 50 or more people toward the end of the project. So that was pretty interesting. And what this seems to indicate is that if you are offering financial incentives to a team, it's probably best to do it using individually tailored incentives and say, I am going to incentivize you, Bob the artist, if you get this dropship model done by the end of March, you get X dollars, and Bob either gets it done or he doesn't, and if so, he gets the financial reward. Those seem to be things like pay for performance plans. Those do seem to be more strongly correlated with better outcomes. Production methodologies. These are a huge topic in the game industry. Everybody loves to talk about Scrum and Agile and things like that. What we found was really interesting. These seem to have no correlation whatsoever with outcomes. From left to right, we have don't know, waterfall, agile using Scrum, and other. So they really had no correlation with outcomes or anything else in the study. And so it doesn't give you a clear indication of which one is better, but it does give you a sense that there really is no magic bullet in terms of production methodologies, and adopting Agile or Scrum probably is not going to be some kind of magic bullet, and you should do what's best for your particular team and the project you're making and who the team is and what your development constraints are. Here's another chart. I'll skip over this. If you want to see it, just go to Game Outcomes on Twitter. But basically, just another example of how Agile and Scrum and Waterfall are pretty much essentially the same thing in terms of their effect on outcomes. Experience had a strong and statistically significant correlation with outcomes. You can see on the right side, teams with an average of 8 or more years of experience have almost no aggregate outcome scores below 50 or so. And they're all much, much closer to 100. So experience does seem to matter quite a bit. And so that's it's pretty obvious, but it's nice validation. Technology solution. We asked, what approach are you using to your game's technology? Are you using a new game engine, a proprietary game engine, external or licensed technology? Are you building on a sequel, or are you doing something else? Here also there was no globally, there were no statistically significant correlations except for number 4. Teams that are building their technology as a sequel to a previous game did get higher outcomes. But when you think about it, that should be pretty obvious. If you're making a sequel, obviously you've got an existing code base that's very well suited to the game you're making. And also the previous game did well enough to actually warrant a sequel, right? You've already got a market, you've established the game's viability, and you've got a code base to start from. So it's really not surprising that those teams would get a higher outcome score in the aggregate than the other teams. It is, however, correlated with team size. Teams using new or proprietary technology or building based on sequels tend, in the aggregate, to be associated with larger teams. That's the horizontal axis along the bottom, as opposed to smaller indie teams, which are more likely to be using external or licensed engines such as Unity or Unreal. All right, let's talk about culture. This is where it gets really interesting. So to talk about culture, I want to talk about the inspiration for the study. Between 2009 and 2012, I got my MSc degree from the Wharton School of Business and the University of Pennsylvania. I took an organizational behavior and design class with Professor Adam Grant, who is Wharton's top-rated professor. And in the organizational behavior and design class, they taught us a model of team effectiveness. In other words, it was a discrete model for how do you evaluate the factors that go into a team's success. And I found that really fascinating because until I took that course, I didn't even know these kinds of things existed. I did not know that there was a way to objectively sort of evaluate the effectiveness of a team overall. And the more I looked at that and the more I understood the model, the more it influenced my own perception of all of the teams that I've worked on in the industry and how their own cultures correlated with all of their different outcomes. So that was pretty fascinating to me. So the model that they use at Wharton School is based on the book Leading Teams, Setting the Stage for Great Performances by J. Richard Hackman. And there are 5 aspects to this model. And before I go further, I want to emphasize that this is a statistically validated model for analyzing teams, right? So there is real data to support this. So there's 5 factors. Is it a real team? You know, is it an appropriate task for a team? Are there clear team boundaries? Do they have clear authority over their own tasks? Is the team composition based on diverse skill sets? Does it have stable membership over time? Number 2, compelling direction. You know, is there a clear motivating goal that guides and motivates the team's efforts? Is there an enabling structure? In other words, are tasks, roles, and responsibilities clearly specified and designed for individual members? Is there a clear definition of who is and isn't on the team? Number 4, supportive context. Are there incentives encouraging the desired behaviors and discouraging the unwanted ones? Are there tools and affordances to get the job done? Do people have the level of psychological safety they need to speak their minds and help the team avoid upcoming problems? Finally, expert coaching. Does the team have access to external motivators, consultants, and educators who can help the team up their game? We also used a second model based on the very popular management book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Absence of trust, fear of commitment, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. So it's actually easier if I explain this using Yoda. So basically the idea behind the 5 dysfunctions model is mistrust leads to fear of conflict. That fear of conflict leads to a lack of commitment. Lack of commitment leads to basically nobody being held accountable because nobody cares enough about the project. Avoidance of accountability leads to a disconnect from your results, right? You ignore the fact that things aren't working out. And inattention to results leads to games that don't live up to their potential. I'm going to refer to these, by the way, as the Hackman and Lencioni models, respectively. So we thought it was very interesting to use these 2 models because the Hackman model sort of describes the external environment or context surrounding and supporting a team, whereas the Lencioni model describes the internal dynamics of a team. So they really ask very different sets of questions. And we thought that was really useful because they're really complementary to each other. They're orthogonal. So they were a perfect fit. So you can find this in the articles on Gamasutra, but we asked, for example, 4 questions about, is this a real team? You know, the first question, the organizational structure and membership of the team were clear from the outset of the project. And then in the graph, we've got its correlation with project delays, ROI, Metacritic, internal goals, aggregate outcome, and then finally the category score for that overall category. But here's what I'd like to do. Rather than just showing you a bunch of numbers, which are pretty boring and don't come across very well in PowerPoint, what I'd like to do is break down for you how some of the questions in each category worked out in terms of the top teams and the bottom teams. So for example, let's take the question, the team composition didn't change during the course of development other than growing when needed, right? So along with the horizontal axis at the bottom, we've got the actual sliding scale that we used to answer the questions. You know, the survey respondents could answer anywhere from disagree completely along the bottom left to agree completely along the bottom right. Now, the blue teams are, you know, the top 25% of teams in terms of their outcome score. And then the red, which you see on the left, is the bottom 25% of teams by their outcome score. So you can see for agree completely, at least 13 respondents among the top 25% of teams said agree completely, and at least 13 respondents said strongly agree. And among the bottom 25% of teams, You know, we had 13 or so people saying disagree completely, 17 or so people saying disagree completely, 15 saying they strongly disagree, and so on. And we're just ignoring the middle 50% of teams, and I hope that's okay. But I think the point will come across well enough even without the middle 50%. So here are two of the other questions in that category along the left side. Most team members had the authority to determine their own tasks on a day-to-day basis. And then on the right side, the organizational structure and membership of the team were clear from the outset. So the one interesting thing you see with all three of those is that the blue graph, the area under that's blue, is shifted to the right. It's much stronger agreement overall with the red teams. So the top 25% of teams tend to agree much more strongly with these statements in the aggregate as opposed to the bottom 25% of teams. So the second aspect of the team effectiveness model is there a compelling direction? Here again, we see an essentially identical curves. The team believed enthusiastically in the vision for this game along the left side. Blue agreed with this much more strongly than red did. The development plan for the game was clear and well communicated to the team. That one is huge. The vision for the final version of the game was clear and well communicated to the team. The third factor, enabling structure. This had an overall correlation of 0.31. Team members' tasks were well defined and clearly specified. Team members' responsibilities and job roles were carefully matched with their particular skills and abilities. My unique skills and talents were valued and utilized while working on this team. Here again, the blue teams in the aggregate agree much more strongly than the red teams do. Number 4, supportive context. On the left, members of the team were able to bring up problems and tough issues. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities or a chance to improve, not a nail in your coffin. And finally, personnel issues within the team, things like teamwork problems and HR issues, were dealt with professionally and appropriately. Again, blue teams agree with this much more strongly than the red teams. Number 5, expert coaching. The team explicitly attempted to develop team members' skills or otherwise assist them in their skill development outside of their normal day-to-day work, and then we received some form of coaching or guidance to enhance our effort or improve our effectiveness as team members. The one on the right is interesting. You can see even on the blue teams, most people didn't agree with this, but where there was agreement, there was more agreement on the blue teams, that is the top 25% of teams, than the red teams. So that was very interesting. Let's see. Okay, sorry, hold on. I apparently rearranged the slide here. Sorry about that. We had a bunch of questions on Lencioni's model as well. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Where is Lencioni's model? Okay, let me go back to it. Sorry about that. Okay, so we had a whole set of questions about Lencioni's model as well. That's the 5 dysfunctions of a team model. And let me go back to the blue and green for that. So here with Lencioni's model, left side we have, it was safe to take a risk on this team and stick your neck out and say something that needed to be said. In the middle, most team members bought into the decisions that were made. On the right side, some team members put their ego or their own need for recognition above the collective goals of the game project. Now this one is very interesting. On the right side, you see the blue is actually shifted way to the left and the red is shifted way to the right. And clearly that is showing us that the top 25% of teams much more strongly disagreed with this statement, whereas a lot of the red teams agreed with it pretty strongly. So finally, we used one more model, which is the Gallup model. This is from the book 12, The Elements of Great Managing by Wagner and Harder. And it's mostly redundant with the Lencioni and Hackman models, but there were 5 factors in here that were sort of orthogonal to both of those books. There was a connection with the company's values that had a correlation of close to 0.4, receiving regular, powerful, and insightful feedback, your peers being committed to doing quality work, my opinion matters, and finally recognition and praise. Various additional game development factors also had surprisingly strong correlation. Shared vision for the game, resolving disagreements about the game's design, justifying and communicating design changes, high turnover had a pretty strong negative correlation, and so on. Finally, we were able to put all of these together into a predictive model. Essentially, what we were able to do was put together a whole bunch of factors into a linear regression model that ended up with a shockingly strong correlation of 0.82 with the aggregate outcome score. So you can see along the bottom is what the score that our model predicts a team will get based on the culture questions. And along the vertical axis, the aggregate outcome score of how well the project actually turned out. So correlation of 0.82 is very, very strong. So finally, before I wrap it up, I want to talk a little bit about crunch. So some people in the game industry have a saying, crunch will always exist in studios that strive for quality. And the idea here is that extraordinary results are going to require extraordinary effort, and that extraordinary effort correlates with extraordinary overtime. And that if you're not slaving away in 80-hour weeks for years at a time, you are doing it wrong, and you're not good enough, and you're a wimp, and so on. So we asked 4 questions about crunch, actually 5 in our survey. 2 of them related to the overall level of crunch. And so here I've organized those results in terms of which teams did the most crunch and which teams did the least crunch, as well as the middle 50% of all of our survey respondents. And what's very interesting is you see on the right side, the 25% of teams that did the most crunch, according to our 2 crunch-related questions, actually got significantly lower outcome scores overall. And this is very statistically significant. They bombed compared to the middle 50% and the 25% that did the least crunch. So it's interesting because you can see the games with the most positive outcome, the outcomes were in the category with the least crunch in the upper left. And the games with the most negative outcomes were in the category with the most crunch. So the category on the right, 71 data points, average score is 48. On the left, 64 data points, average score of 62. A little bit about voluntary crunch. We also had 2 questions about whether crunch was voluntary or mandatory. It's important to note this does not relate to the overall quantity of crunch. It is strictly, asking if I crunched, did I do so of my own accord, or was my boss telling me to? So here on the right side, we have the teams that gave us the top 25% in terms of saying that crunch was the most voluntary, that any overtime they did was totally voluntary. And on the left side, the 25% of teams that agreed the most strongly with crunch was mandatory and I was forced to do it. As you can see, the mandatory crunch game studios had much lower outcomes overall than the middle 50%, very statistically significant, whereas on the right side, the most voluntary crunch had a much better outcome overall. All right, I'll skip over some of this in the interest of time. Here's a graph that puts it all together in terms of voluntary along the horizontal axis and the amount of crunch along the vertical axis. So you can see the left column is the most voluntary, the right column is the most mandatory. The top row is the most amount of crunch, the bottom row is the lowest amount of crunch. So what's really interesting here, if you look at the median score, the lower left corner actually has the highest score. Those teams that were most likely to say it was voluntary crunch and I did it less of it than the other teams had a median score of 70.62 in terms of aggregate outcome. Whereas the top right corner, the team saying they do the most crunch and it's the most mandatory, had an aggregate outcome score of 39.84. So that was very revealing. There's the, let's see how much time I have left. Okay, I'm actually getting pretty close to my time limit. I'm going to have to skip over the crunch salvage hypothesis stuff. I'm just running out of time, and I apologize for that. I want to make sure there's plenty of time to answer questions at the end. But basically, I would recommend reading the article on Gamasutra. It goes into detail about the crunch salvage hypothesis. But basically, we were testing the hypothesis of, hey, maybe the correlation is just because crunch is more likely to occur on projects that are already in trouble, and these results are just picking up that underlying correlation. And we're sort of separating out the culture factors from the crunch factors and saying, okay, the culture factors already predict outcomes with a very strong correlation, and then what happens if you layer the crunch factors on top of that? How much does the additional crunch get you on top of what you would already expect the outcome to be? And the bottom line is basically none at all. So that was very revealing. Okay, finally, non-correlated factors, things like team size, production methodology, financial incentives, and use of cross-functional versus per-discipline teams. These were not correlated with outcomes at all on any global level. We asked a bunch of additional questions about, do you have a friend on the team? Do you share team members with other projects inside the company? Do you prefer face-to-face communication or email? Do you rely on temp workers or contractors? Do you use outsourced labor? These also had no correlations at all with outcomes. A couple quick conclusions. Start demanding evidence. Our industry is chock full of untested assumptions, and a lot of practices persist because we don't question them. Number two, the real opportunities for improving our odds of better outcomes are mostly cultural. Back in 2012, Todd Howard, who's the executive producer of Bethesda Game Studios, gave a keynote speech at DICE, and he showed this slide, and he said the following: this is one of the big rules that we have, which is the plan that you have is not as important as your culture. So you see a lot of game makers will say, so here's the big schedule and here's everything we're going to do. You know, if they're really trying, they're going to run into problems. And those problems are solved by the culture you have on your team. I have a slightly different way of putting it, which is this. I believe that every game is a reflection of the team that created it. If you want to make a better game, you need to build a better culture on your team. Again, leadership, teamwork, and cultural factors accounted for about 85% of the difference between the best teams and the rest. So before crunching, try putting more focus and energy into the time that you have. There's an established science to building good teams, and our findings mirror those of management science pretty much perfectly. Finally, design your culture intentionally. Write up your mission and value statement. It matters a lot. Don't tolerate bad culture. Don't tolerate people or attitudes that hold it back. And don't tolerate anyone with low emotional intelligence in a leadership position on a game development team. So for further reading, those are the 3 books that we used. Also my Gamasutra articles up on Gamasutra. So I think I was I was about 50 minutes, so there should be time for some questions.
Alrighty. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Let's see, do we have anyone who would like to go for it?
Hi, Paul. I'm Randy.
Hey, Randy.
So my question is, you've released this series a little while ago. Have you had anyone come back and say that they have changed their culture specifically because of things they've seen from your results and they're seeing an improvement because of it?
I have not yet. No, not that specifically. I have done it on my own team. In fact, there's an Excel spreadsheet associated with article number 5 that was beta tested on my own team here at Mothership Entertainment. I've gotten a ton of feedback on the articles, but no one's specifically coming back and saying we've actually used these yet.
Okay.
And if there's any other questions I can answer about game development, about my own experiences, about programming, production, game design, any of that kind of stuff, I'm happy to answer them.
Cool. I was going to ask one more question about the management science. You had a conclusion that said you saw a high correlation between the outcomes from these surveys and traditional management science.
Yes.
I wonder if going into the project, did you have your own hypothesis and did it align with that outcome, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, our hypothesis was that the one from the those books that I mentioned, the Leading Teams book by Hackman, the Five Dysfunctions of a Team book by Lencioni, the Gallup model based on the book 12. The hypothesis was that those represent, for the most part, the current state of management science, and what management science would tell you makes a good team, and that those had strong correlations. And I was very surprised by how strong the correlations were. At the same time, I was expecting a lot of other factors like production methodology would have very strong correlations, and finding that they didn't was very surprising. Waterfall gets bashed in the game industry a lot. People act as if, planning your project according to waterfall scheduling is a relic, and that either Scrum or Agile is the holy grail. I believed that myself at one point or another, and I feel like to a certain extent we've debunked that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
So, you were mentioning how, like, after the study, you kind of made some changes in your own team and implemented that. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that.
Sure. Yeah, great question. Essentially what we did was, for part 5 of the article, there's a little Excel spreadsheet that is, it's basically a way to survey your own game development team. And so we took, I think, the 30 most relevant questions from our entire survey, and then built right in Excel a little mathematical model that would spit out a correlation and say, okay, answer these multiple choice drop down questions right in Excel, and you will get strong versus weak correlations. And here's where we rank you in terms of actually being able to ship your game on time, or being able to get a good ROI. And it's actually interesting. I did hear from one of my colleagues in the industry that he went and used that spreadsheet, and for some of the previous teams that he had worked on, and he was kind of shocked that, like, yes, the team that it told me that I would get a really crappy ROI for the project got a crappy ROI. It told me I would, have project delays on the one where we actually had project delays. So he was fairly well convinced by that model. Anyway, but I essentially beta tested the survey on my own team, so that was fairly interesting. And it showed us, we did very well overall, but it showed us that there were some areas of leadership, where we could step forward a little bit in terms of tightening up our production, and checking in with our art team on a more regular basis in particular. And also, I don't want to go into anything about my team here at Mothership Entertainment, but it's been an interesting exercise managing artists, and I'm much more of a programmer / designer, and it's my first time managing artists, and so we have 2 artists with very different personalities, very different working styles. So a lot of my work on the team over the last 2 years has been getting these guys to communicate the right way, to soften some of their sharp edges and things like that. It's a lot of the things described in the Lencioni model, making sure that there's trust on your team, that trust leads to accountability, and really paying attention. So it's not just to the results that you're getting. And so it's not just an artist sitting in his cubicle going, I'm just making this one building for the game, and if Paul likes it, I'm good to go. That they are actually participating in the focus test, that they are playing the game, that they're seeing how that building is used in the context of the game, and paying attention to that result.
Thank you. Also, so with the artists and programmers, do you have to kind of apply different, kind of different cultural things to get, are they separate things entirely, or do you have, an overall kind of standard?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds just like you're asking a broader question of managing artists versus programmers, and generally artists and programmers, do tend to be very, very different, of course, because artists, I can say this as a non-artist, artists do tend to be more creative on average than programmers. And so, but it really just comes down to who's on your team, what kind of culture does your studio have, what kind of culture do they want, what are their different personalities. If you've got an introvert dealing with an extrovert, that's something you're going to have to go out of your way to actively balance. Make sure the introvert-extrovert doesn't come across too strong. Make sure the introvert doesn't get intimidated by the extrovert, things like that. So in terms of just artists and programmers overall at different teams that I've worked on, it's interesting. Different studios break it up different ways, and I don't know that there's any one right way to do it. You hear a lot about cross-functional teams. When I worked at Retro Studios, it was essentially you've got a big programmer area that is just programmers, and you have an engineering lead supervising all of us. You have a design pit, and then you have all of the artists. And so you have these 3 different units being treated separately. When I left after Metroid Prime 3 shipped, they were in the process of switching to much more cross-functional teams where you would have small strike teams of maybe 5 or 6 people where they would put 2 artists and 1 designer together with 1 or 2 engineers and say, okay, strike team, you are now responsible for getting this feature into the game. And so far in the Game Outcomes Project study, we're not seeing any solid evidence that one structure is superior to the other in any global level, right? It probably has a lot more to do with what particular project you're trying to create and how your teams are managed, rather than whether they're cross-functional or divided up by discipline.
And also, side question, the spreadsheet you mentioned, is that something you can make available? Or?
Oh, it is available.
Okay.
If you just do a Google search for the Game Outcomes Project, you'll find the Gamasutra articles. Each of those 5 articles has links to all the other 4 articles, as well as the methodology page, which is on my blog. And I believe you can download that spreadsheet from the 5th article in the series.
Gotcha.
And if not, just send me an email. These guys have my email.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hey, Paul. This is something that you kind of mentioned a couple times, but I'm wondering. I know, we didn't find a magic bullet between Scrum and Agile and some other Kanban or other different methodology, but do you either have evidence or just personal thoughts on, does it matter to have some explicit methodology, or even broader than that, are we explicitly addressing these cultural factors? Either I'm talking about it openly, or it just kind of happens however it happens.
Right. One of the interesting things, and I sort of skipped over that slide that had all the huge crazy dots everywhere, but one of the interesting things that slide shows was that we did have an answer that people could answer for basically, I don't know what my team's methodology is. And for that answer, basically the outcome scores just plummeted through the floor for teams that were more than 10 people, right? And so basically what I read into that is that if your team does not have a production methodology and you're more than just 2 or 3 guys making an indie game together, that's a really bad thing, and you should get one, and you should get the one that's right for your studio. And I mean, certainly there are very important differences between production methodologies. A lot of it just has to do with, what are your development constraints? Am I making a strategy game or a first-person shooter? Am I dealing with a team of 50 people or 100? Have they worked with each other before? What are their expectations? What is the existing culture and set of values already like on my team? Waterfall in general, gets a lot of flack in the game industry just because it is so rigid and methodical and expects you to be done X at a certain point in time. And when you're developing games, you do need a certain amount of flexibility. Every single game I've ever worked on, you come to multiple decision points during game development where you're like, oh, the thing that I thought would be fun about our game is not what's actually fun. What's fun is actually the totally different thing. And if you're stuck with a rigid waterfall development schedule, that means that you cannot simultaneously stick to the schedule and also allocate a whole bunch of time to go off and run and chase these potentially very exciting new features. Otherwise you have to totally revise your plan, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages. I tend to think that one of the reasons waterfall does so well is it correlates with teams, large teams that have discipline and that know exactly what they're making, right? If you are making the next Call of Duty game, right, and it's a pretty much direct sequel to the previous Call of Duty game, and your team knows what they've done before, and you've already got a design doc written, and you know exactly what team you're making, it probably makes a lot more sense to go with a waterfall style of planning. So you can say, okay, this game is going to take exactly 11 months, and here's what each and every artist and engineer is going to be doing over those, however many months on the project, and manage it that way. It probably makes a lot more sense to do that than to try and come up with an agile plan. On the other hand, if you're a studio like mine that's 4 guys making something that hasn't really been made before, and where we've had to, go through a bit of a journey to find the fun, and we've been surprised at a couple points during development, you probably want a plan that's more agile and that gives you more flexibility. And you say, let's not bother trying to plan this thing, 9 months in advance, because we don't know what the game is going to be. We're going to just constantly, every week, what are the top priorities? What are the things that really scare us? Let's work on those first. Every week, every month, you work to reduce your risk until finally you're like, okay, we're 2 months from actually being able to ship this thing. And then you can switch to a more rigid, development plan.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Sorry, I was confirming, but it turns out you already canceled.
So I noticed that toward the end you were saying that there's a whole raft of different aspects of making games that didn't seem to have an effect on the outcome.
Yes.
I wonder, does that just make you want to shake the snow globe? Do you just want to pick an aspect and try something completely different for variety because you have a reason to believe that it won't have a strong impact on the result?
Yeah, I mean, for some of those questions, I really did take another look and said, okay, maybe it's one of those, maybe this thing truly doesn't matter, or maybe it depends on what type of team you're on. Maybe teams that are using waterfall are more likely to have, certain other factors be more important than teams that are using Agile, for example, or maybe a large team of 200 people working on the next Medal of Honor game, this factor is going to have the opposite impact from a tiny 5-person indie studio. So I did look at a lot of those. In a few cases, I found correlations that were fairly interesting. And I would recommend going to Game Outcomes on Twitter, and we've posted a few of those. But for the most part, it's either something correlates with the outcome or it doesn't. So there was that one where it correlated with team size. Yeah, it was technology factors correlated with team size rather than actual game outcomes. So
cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Hello. Is there any findings, or maybe even just from your experience, about maybe game genres and culture and that kind of thing? Like, if they were making this particular type of game, then this type of culture or that kind of thing is better or worse?
It's interesting. I didn't include it in the slideshow, but if you go to the Game Outcomes Project's articles, the very first one, we actually did have a question on genre, and we just got so many different responses in terms of, people are literally working on everything under the sun. Sports games, FPS, RTS, turn-based strategy, whatever. The problem with that is over essentially we got 273 data points. So those 273 data points got spread very, very thin across the 20 to 25 genres that we listed, to the point where it's not a statistically significant sample, and you can't really make any interesting generalizations. I'm hoping the next time we do the study, we'll have maybe 500 to 1,000 responses, and we'll be able to draw some more interesting conclusions. We did find, of course, first-person shooter teams are bigger than most, and massively multiplayer online games are bigger than most. And also that's not particularly surprising because, you ask anybody in the industry, a puzzle game versus an MMO, they're going to tell you that MMO is going to have the bigger team, right? And similarly, aggregate outcome scores on average were pretty similar for most of these, and the differences that did exist were not terribly statistically significant. The one interesting thing to me is that when I look at the correlation of game genre versus aggregate outcome, the teams the genres that tend to have the lowest outcomes overall are the really crowded ones. First-person shooters and MMOs. There's so many teams out there trying to make first-person shooters and MMOs that I think it lowers their aggregate outcome because there's so much competition.
Yeah, I guess so. That was maybe that follow-up was that. What's the next step or ideas for the project? You kind of, I guess, continue to do more surveys. Very interested in continuing to see, more results as you expand, and do more sampling.
We've got sort of an offshoot of the project that's going on right now. One of our team members is asking leader interviews, interviewing a whole bunch of leaders of development teams around the industry. It's more anecdotal than statistical, but I think it's still very useful since that'll help guide us in the future. And then with the next round of the Game Outcomes project, which hopefully we'll put out the survey later this year, because hopefully my game will be shipped by then and I'll actually have time to do that. We're going to go through the previous survey, chop off basically the lowest correlating 50% of survey questions along with the ones that were pretty much redundant with the other survey questions, and also add a few more questions to the mix. We'd like to ask about, people always ask us about, ethnicity and gender, and okay, does having a, workplace that's dominated by one gender or another, does that influence the outcome? I have no idea, but I'm curious to test that. We would also like to better quantify a lot of aspects of our study, like crunch. If you ask me right now how many hours a week for how many weeks constitutes crunch, I couldn't tell you. I personally work between 45 and 50 hours a week generally. I don't consider that crunch, but I know there's some people who would. And so that's certainly one of the weaknesses of the current study is I'd really like to nail down, okay, overall we worked this many weeks on average, hours per week on average. During peak periods we worked this many hours a week. When we were in the last 3 months as we were getting ready to ship our game, here's how many hours we worked. I think that'll help us more precisely quantify those questions around crunch.
Great, thanks.
So we have one more question from Two Scoops, which is a small studio out in Louisville. This is their typical question. What is your favorite flavor of ice cream?
I'm actually on a super low carb diet right now. I'm on the HCG diet, so I'm not allowed to eat carbohydrates until
before that happened. Before you were.
Until March 4th, no carbs for me at all. Cold turkey. Before that, I'd say vanilla with some interesting frosting on top. I know it's a terribly boring answer.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it. And I'll hang around for you.
Great. All right, so this has been the monthly meeting for RunJumpDev. We do have a couple of other events coming up later this year. We're working on getting submissions in for our Rules and Play art gallery. It's going to be happening in June. This is a repeat of last year when we have an art exhibit focused on play experienced through interaction. And like I said, we're taking submissions through this Friday, and it should be a really exciting show. Please come out to the Living Arts and Sciences Center later this year when we've got our artists showing stuff off. It'll be great. We also, in April, we've got Vector, which is our game developer conference. This is it's a regional game development conference. If you'd like to come out and chat with other people from the Bluegrass and Indiana and Midwest region about game development, that's a great opportunity for it. You can go to vectorconf.com and check out our schedule and tickets and things like that. And then towards the end of the year, we're doing Rules and Play. Lex Play. Got my events mixed up. Lex Play is a consumer-focused gaming event, gaming show. This is our first year doing it. It's kind of like a micro PAX kind of a thing. So we're looking forward to that, and that's going to be in late October, just before Halloween, a Friday and Saturday. You can go to lexplaycon.com to find tickets and information, and you can keep track of all of our events if you go to our website, runjumpdev.org/events, and you can always find us on Twitter if you have questions at runjumpdev. So that's about it for us. Again, thank you very much, Paul. Where can we find you if we want to find out who you are, what you're doing, what you're talking about?
Yes. Can you guys read the chat, by the way, if I post them here? Is the chat visible in your screen?
I think if you pull it up. Yeah, I think we've got the chat.
Great. Okay, so I am, my studio is Mothership Team on Twitter. We're also, let me get a link to our Facebook site. Hang on a second.
And we'll make sure to post all this stuff in the description for the video once we post it in March.
Great. So that's us on Facebook, Mothership Entertainment on Facebook. The Game Outcomes Project is just Game Outcomes on Twitter, and we occasionally post interesting data analyses or announcements about the Game Outcomes Project on that Twitter site as we have time. So if you're interested in the Game Outcomes Project, follow us there. And then as for me, you can contact me. Let me just give you my email. If you have questions about the Game Outcomes Project that you'd like to ask directly, I recommend asking questions about the project on that Twitter if possible. But if you have something you'd like to ask me directly, maybe it's questions about getting into the industry or about my experiences or anything like that, my email is paul.tozour@gmail.com.
Cool. Thank you very much, Paul.
You're welcome.
We'll see you around.
All right. Can I log off?